lot of your work revolves around animal intelligence and emotion. For a lot of people, that's a very foreign concept. Could you give some examples from your experience?
Well, most of us have no experience with other animals except the dogs and cats that we live with. And everybody who has, just about everybody who has a dog or a cat knows that they have intelligence. They know what's going on. They understand the world that they live in, and they have emotions. Sometimes they feel fine. Sometimes they feel relaxed. Sometimes they're very on edge. Sometimes they're hungry. Sometimes they're frightened. If you have dogs, sometimes they are aggressive. They are defending you and the home. Okay, so that's the only two animals most people ever have any really direct experience watching. But if you watch lots of animals, if you happen to be a biologist and you get the ability to spend many hours a day, day after day, maybe sitting in a hide or watching from some distance, you see these animals going about their own life, and you realize that they're very, very aware. In fact, they're super aware of what's going on around them. Many of them have senses that are much sharper than humans with much faster reaction times. And they also can be, uh, you know, exuberant, I guess is a word, about courtship, or gentle with their mates, or fierce with their rivals and their competitors. I mean, a lot of these things are just very, very common across the board, but most people just never get a chance to see them.
On this spectrum, sometimes you have two kind of extreme arguments where there's one side saying that animals are emotionless, incapable of intelligence, and then there's an argument that says they're just like humans, kind of straying into anthropomorphism. What can you say about the middle ground in between that argument?
Well, the truth is in the middle ground. They're a lot like humans. I mean, we're all vertebrates. You're talking about vertebrate animals. That's usually what we're talking about. Mammals, birds. We evolved along the same lineage, and we have the same nervous system pretty much, and we have the same hormones and brain chemicals that create the moods and motivations that we feel. They have all the same stuff. They act like we do in similar situations, whether they're attracted to something or curious about something or afraid of something. I mean, they're never afraid of something they shouldn't be afraid of. You don't see an animal that's afraid of its food. That wouldn't make any sense. Everything they do is very sensible and logical. Um, they're cautious around strangers. They're defensive of their territories. So they're a lot like us. We're a lot like them. We are animals, so we can't be different from animals because we can't be different from ourselves. But they are not human animals, and humans are different in some ways. Everything is different in some way. A canary is different from an elephant, is different from a whale, is different from a box turtle or a chimpanzee. They're all different in their different ways, and they have different senses that they emphasize. Some are more focused on smell or hearing. We're more visual, but many of them are kind of superhuman at what they do. They're faster, they're more perceptive, they're stronger than we are. We seem to excel at manipulating things, and from that we create technology. Most other animals, tools, many animals don't have tools. The ones that do have pretty simple tools. We we have developed pretty recently pretty complicated tools. But until not long ago, there were many cultures that did not have a tool with a moving part. They had spears and digging things, and they might have had bow and arrow or something like that. Pretty simple. Um, chimpanzees, in some places, chimpanzees have several tools. Sometimes they carry those tools from one place to place. So what you see in humans, you see some of that in some other animal. So the truth is in between. They're not exactly like us, but they're quite similar to us in some ways, and they exceed us in some ways. They're more accomplished in some ways than we are.
There's also animals out there with multiple senses that humans don't have. How do you think that affects the conversation around intelligence?
Well, intelligence is defined in different ways by different people. When I talk about intelligence, what I mean is the ability to see or be in a situation that you have no experience with and figure out a new way of reacting to that experience. To me, that's intelligence. It has to do with insight and being able to basically imagine a solution to a problem that you have no experience with. So I'm not sure that the sensory abilities of other animals affects their intelligence. It affects their experience of the world. Many birds can see ultraviolet light. We cannot see ultraviolet light, but all the things around us that are reflecting light in the ultraviolet spectrum, many birds can see that. So things to them look differently colored. Many of the things that we see as very pretty, like certain flowers, also reflect ultraviolet and would look very intense, much more intense and much more vivid if we were birds.
You've written a lot of books about this subject, talking about environmental issues as well. Your most recent book came out in April, Becoming Wild. Can you talk about the work that went into it?
Yeah, that book is about culture in other animals. And in humans, when we say culture, we tend to think of the culture we have right now in our particular culture. But what culture basically is it's the answer to the question of how do we live here where we happen to live. And you get that answer basically from your parents and from the elders in your social group. You're just born into a group, and how they live is what you learn about how to live. That's really what culture is. In humans, culture takes many different forms, but that's what it is. Culture is what you learn. It's not something purely instinctive. It's not what you figure out on your own. It's what you learn mostly from your parents and from other elders about how you live where you live. So it can vary from place to place. And many people never realize that there are a lot of other animals with culture. They don't have human culture. They don't have the kind of culture we have or culture that's as elaborate, but it's in many ways it's as important to them to learn the answer to how do we live where we live, what is food, where do we go in different seasons. If it's a species that makes tools, how do we make tools? What tools do we make? Those kinds of things.
Those are some really great points. And I also wanted to bring up one of your other books, Beyond Words. What was your biggest discovery when working through that book?
Well, that book doesn't talk about humans too much, but in talking about the intelligence and the emotional capacities of other species and how they perceive the world, their cognitive abilities, the thing that really jumped out at me at the end of working on that book was human intelligence is incredibly limited, and we don't see it, which is one of our intellectual limitations. But our ability to see and understand or even be interested in the world, our ability to imagine and do things better is terribly limited, which is why we have the gigantic problems that we have.
What has been fulfilling about trying to push those limits? What has been fulfilling about your research?
Well, two things. One, I get to go to fantastic places to be with fantastic people looking at spectacular animals of enormous beauty, and having the extreme privilege of being able to share those experiences and those impressions with people. It's very, very lucky that I can do this, like I'm doing right now with you, for instance.
Speaking of younger people like me, several of your books have been adapted for children and younger audiences. Why do you think it's important to share that message with them as well?
One likes to, I guess the word would be teach, but one likes to share with younger people. If you've seen wonderful things in the world, you want to show other people. You want to show people your own age. You want to show people younger than you. So that's one of the things. The other thing is that the values that we have are causing great harm to many people and especially many other species and many habitats, and they're causing the world to lose a lot of its beauty and a lot of its compassion. So I always have thought that most people get their main values by the time they're around 12 years old. And so I think it's very important to try to share impressions of the world and what you think you've learned about what's important to young people.